Texas, 1945. The sun burned white across the horizon, turning the camp's mess hall windows into squares of blinding light. Inside, 23 German women stood motionless before tables laden with food they had forgotten existed. Eggs, butter, fresh bread still warm from the oven, coffee that smelled like memory itself. They had expected punishment, hunger, the same rations that had kept them hollow-eyed across the Atlantic. Instead, an American cook in a stained apron gestured at the spread and said something incomprehensible. Then he smiled, and the war, for just a moment, stopped making sense. The ship had crossed the Atlantic in February, when the ocean turned gray, as gunmetal and just as cold. Below deck, in compartments designed for cargo rather than people, Marguerite Hoffman pressed her back against the steel hull and felt the vibrations of the engines rattling through her spine. Around her, women whispered in the darkness. Some prayed. Others simply stared at nothing, their faces slack with exhaustion. They were auxiliaries, Nakrit and Felfern, communications helpers, telephone operators, clerks who had worn uniforms but never fired weapons. Most were between 19 and 25. Girls, really, though the war had aged them in ways that went deeper than years. They had been captured in France, in Belgium, in the final chaotic weeks as the regime's territories collapsed inward like a dying star. Marguerite had worked at a signal station outside Strasbourg. She remembered the morning the American forces arrived, the sudden silence when the transmission stopped, the way her hands had trembled as she raised them above her head, fingers spread wide in a gesture she had practiced only in nightmares. An officer had asked her name in careful textbook German. She had answered. Then they had taken her papers, her identification disc, and loaded her onto a truck with 17 other women, all of them too stunned to cry. The propaganda had prepared them for savagery, for humiliation, for violence that would confirm everything they had been told about the enemy. Instead, they found bureaucracy, forms to fill out, medical examinations conducted by tired-looking doctors who barely made eye contact, transfer orders written in triplicate. The machinery of war grinding forward with the same indifferent efficiency on both sides. During the crossing, food came twice daily. Hard biscuits, thin soup that tasted of salt and tin. Portions measured precisely, neither generous nor cruel. Just enough to keep bodies functioning. Some women could not eat. The motion of the ship and the fear in their stomachs twisted together until swallowing became impossible. They grew thinner. Their uniforms, already worn, began to hang loose. Marguerite forced herself to eat. She had learned this discipline during the final months in France, when rations grew scarce and hunger became another enemy to outlast. She chewed slowly, making each mouthful last, and thought about nothing. The trick was to keep your mind empty, to exist only in the immediate present, in the taste of stale bread and the rhythm of your own breathing. The future was too frightening, the past too painful. Only now was bearable. They arrived at Newport News, Virginia, on a morning shrouded in fog. The women were lined up on deck, blinking in the gray light, watching the American coastline materialize like something from a fever dream. Docks, warehouses, cranes lifting cargo with mechanical precision. Everything looked clean, orderly, untouched by war. A woman named Hild stood beside Marguerite, gripping the rail so hard her knuckles turned white. "It does not look real," she whispered. "Nothing is broken." She was right. After years in a Europe pounded to rubble, the sight of intact buildings felt like a violation of natural law. How could this place exist while their cities burned? How could these people move through their ordinary days while the world tore itself apart across the ocean? From there, they were placed on trains. Not cattle cars, as some had feared, but regular passenger carriages with worn seats and windows that actually opened. Guards accompanied them, young men with rifles and expressions of profound boredom. One passed down the aisle, distributing sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. White bread, actual meat. Marguerite bit into hers slowly, tasting bologna and mustard and something close to disbelief. The train rolled south and west for 3 days, crossing landscapes that seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. Flat farmland giving way to rolling hills, then to spaces so vast and empty they made the sky feel like a presence, a weight pressing down. The women watched through dirty windows, too exhausted for conversation, as America unfolded around them like a map drawn at impossible scale. They arrived at Camp Swift near Bastrop, Texas, on a day when the heat lay across the land like something solid. The air shimmered. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the unpaved roads. Mesquite trees cast shadows thin as wire, offering no relief. The women stepped off the train into sunlight that felt physical, aggressive, nothing like the gray light they had known in Europe. The camp sprawled across acres of cleared land, row after row of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. But there were no walls, no concrete bunkers, no sense of permanent imprisonment. It looked temporary, improvised, like something that might vanish when the war finally ended. An officer addressed them in English, his words translated by a tired-looking woman in a Red Cross uniform. They would be assigned to barracks. They would follow camp regulations. They would work. Details would come later. For now, they needed to be processed, photographed, documented, made official. The mess hall stood at the center of camp, a long wooden structure with screens instead of windows. Inside, tables stretched in neat rows beneath slowly turning ceiling fans. The smell hit them first. Coffee, bacon, something baking. Scents so rich and unexpected that several women stopped in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter. An American cook, a heavy-set man with gray hair and a face weathered by years, gestured them forward. His name, they would learn, was Frank. He had been cooking for army camps since before the war, feeding thousands with the same steady competence he might apply to feeding his own family. He looked at the women with neither hostility nor pity, just assessment. These were people who needed food. He had food. The equation was simple. "Sit," the translator said. "You will eat." Marguerite sat. Around her, the other women settled onto benches with the careful movements of people expecting punishment. The tables were already set. Plates, cups, utensils that gleamed in the light filtering through the screens. Then the food came. Eggs, scrambled, fluffy, glistening with butter. Not one egg per person rationed carefully, but heaping spoonfuls served by workers who moved down the line with practiced efficiency. Bacon, strips of it, crispy and dark, still sizzling faintly. Toast. White bread, golden brown, with actual butter and jam available in small bowls. Oatmeal, milk, orange juice in pitchers that caught the light, and coffee. Real coffee, black and strong and steaming, poured into cups until they were nearly full. The women stared. Hild touched her plate as if it might vanish. Her fingers trembled slightly. Beside her, a young woman named Annalise began to cry, tears running silently down her face while her hands remained frozen on the table. Marguerite picked up her fork. The eggs tasted like butter and salt, and something indefinable that she realized, with a shock that went through her chest like electricity, was abundance. Not survival rations carefully measured. Not food meant merely to sustain. This was food made with the assumption that there was more, that there would always be more. She ate slowly, forcing herself to maintain control, while her body screamed to devour everything on the plate. Around her, other women did the same. Some ate mechanically, their faces blank. Others wept as they chewed. A few could not eat at all, paralyzed by the sudden reversal of everything they had expected. Frank watched from the serving line, his expression unreadable. Later, he would tell the camp chaplain that he had never seen people look at food the way those German women did. Like it was dangerous, like it might explode. The meal lasted 30 minutes. When it ended, when the plates were cleared, and the women filed out into the Texas heat, Marguerite felt something shift inside her chest. Not gratitude exactly. Not yet. Just confusion. A crack in the wall of certainty that had sustained her through capture and imprisonment and the crossing. They had been told Americans were wasteful, decadent, that their abundance masked spiritual poverty. But standing in that mess hall, watching workers scrape uneaten portions into bins without ceremony or concern, she saw something different. Not decadence, just scale. A country so large, so productive, that feeding prisoners generously was simpler than calculating minimal rations. The work began the next day. The women were divided into groups and assigned to various camp operations. Kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning barracks, tending the small vegetable gardens that supplemented the camp's food supply. The labor was physical, but not brutal. 12 hours daily, with breaks for meals and water. Marguerite was assigned to the main kitchen, working under Frank's supervision. She arrived at dawn, when the air still held a trace of coolness, and the light came slanted and golden across the camp. Frank showed her the layout. Massive stoves, industrial sinks, storage rooms lined with shelves that held more food than she had seen in years. Flour in 50-pound sacks, sugar, salt, canned goods stacked floor to ceiling, potatoes in bins, onions, carrots, meat in the walk-in freezer, sides of beef and pork hanging on hooks like some surreal sculpture. The abundance was incomprehensible. Frank spoke slowly, using gestures when words failed. Marguerite's English was minimal, picked up from films and songs before the regime had banned them. But cooking had its own language. She watched, she learned. She began to understand the rhythm of feeding 500 men 3 times daily. The work was hard. Her hands blistered from peeling potatoes. Her back ached from standing at the prep tables. But there was something almost meditative about it. The simple physicality. The immediate, tangible results. Carrots became soup. Dough became bread. Cause and effect, clear and uncomplicated. And she ate. All kitchen workers did. Frank insisted on it, gesturing at the food with an expression that suggested questioning this was pointless. They ate the same meals as the guards, the same as the camp administrators. Sometimes better, sampling dishes before they went to the mess hall, testing seasonings, eating the slightly burnt edges of roasts that could not be served. Marguerite gained weight. Not quickly, but steadily. Her uniforms, which had hung loose after the crossing, began to fit again. Her face lost the hollow-cheeked gauntness that had made her look decades older. Other women noticed the same changes in themselves, bodies remembering what it meant to be properly fed, strength returning in increments. Behind the women's barracks, someone had planted a garden. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, green beans climbing up strings tied to wooden stakes. It was not large, maybe 30 feet square, but it was meticulously maintained. An older woman named Ilse tended it with the focus of someone engaged in holy work. She had been a farmer's daughter in Thuringia, she told Marguerite one evening. She knew soil and seasons and the particular patience required to coax food from earth. Here, in this strange place with its brutal sun and alkaline soil, she found purpose. She could grow things, make them live, create abundance from seeds and water and attention. The camp administrators encouraged this. They provided seeds, tools, advice. An agricultural extension agent from Bastrop visited monthly, examining plants and offering suggestions through a translator. The garden was practical. It supplemented the food supply, but it was also symbolic. Prisoners who grew food were prisoners who believed in a future. Marguerite helped sometimes in the evenings after kitchen duty ended. She liked the feel of dirt under her fingernails, the smell of tomato plants in the heat, the simple satisfaction of pulling weeds. Ilse taught her to pinch off suckers, to stake plants properly, to harvest at the right moment when ripeness peaked. They talked while they worked. Careful conversations that skirted around the war, around politics, around everything that had brought them here. Instead, they discussed practical things. How deep to plant beans, whether the peppers needed more water, what to do about the beetles eating the squash leaves. One evening, Ilse straightened up, pressing a hand to her lower back, and looked at Marguerite with an expression that was almost apologetic. "I thought we would be punished," she said quietly. "For everything that was done," Marguerite nodded. She had thought the same thing. "Maybe this is punishment," Ilse continued, gesturing at the garden, at the camp, at the food they ate, and the work they did. "Maybe having to accept kindness from people we were told to hate. Maybe that is harder than anything else they could do to us." The abundance extended beyond food. The camp store, open twice weekly, sold items that seemed impossible. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap that smelled of flowers, magazines, writing paper, lipstick in a dozen shades. The women could purchase these things with small amounts of money they earned from their work. Pennies, really, but enough to buy small luxuries. Marguerite stood in the store one afternoon, staring at the shelves, unable to process what she was seeing. In Germany, such items had vanished years ago. Everything went to the war effort. Everything was rationed, measured, controlled. Here, prisoners could buy chocolate. She selected a bar of Hershey's, paying with coins that felt unreal in her palm. She ate it slowly that evening, sitting on her bunk, letting each square melt on her tongue, while trying to remember the last time she had tasted chocolate. The memory would not come. Too many things had vanished between then and now. Other women made similar discoveries. Annalise bought lipstick, a bright red that looked garish against her pale skin, but made her smile for the first time in weeks. Hilde spent her earnings on writing paper, composing long letters home that might or might not ever be delivered. Another woman, whose name was Frida, bought cigarettes and traded them for extra shower time, for a better bunk location, for small favors that made camp life marginally easier. The Americans seemed puzzled by the women's reactions to basic goods. One guard, a young man from Oklahoma named Robert, tried to explain to Marguerite that this was normal, standard, nothing special. "It's just stuff," he said through the translator, gesturing at the store shelves. "We got plenty," but Marguerite could not make him understand. Plenty was not a concept she knew anymore. Plenty meant more than enough. It meant waste was possible, because there was always more. In Germany, in the world she had left, nothing was plentiful. Everything was calculated, controlled, extracted down to the last possible drop of utility. Letters arrived sporadically, passed through layers of censorship before reaching the camp. Marguerite received her first in April, 3 months after her capture. The envelope was thin, worn soft by handling, covered in stamps and official markings. Inside, 2 pages in her mother's precise handwriting. She read it alone, sitting on her bunk after the evening meal. The words were careful, revealing nothing that censors might find problematic. Her mother wrote about weather, about a neighbor's cat, about bread ratios, and how the garden was doing without Marguerite's help. Between the lines, Marguerite could read exhaustion, fear, the weight of living in a country that was losing everything. "We are managing," her mother wrote. "Do not worry about us. Take care of yourself wherever you are." Marguerite folded the letter carefully and placed it under her pillow. That night, she lay awake listening to other women breathing in the darkness, and thought about the breakfast she had eaten that morning. Pancakes, syrup, sausages. More food in one meal than her mother might see in a week. The guilt was complicated. She had done nothing to deserve this relative comfort. She had simply been captured by the right enemy, in the right war, at the right time. The Americans had space, food, systems designed to handle prisoners according to international conventions. If she had been captured by other forces in other places, her fate might have been completely different. Other women received letters too. Some letters brought relief. Others brought grief, news of deaths, destroyed homes, missing family members. One woman, whose name was Gerda, received word that her hometown had been bombed to rubble. She stopped speaking for 3 days, moving through her duties with mechanical precision, while her eyes remained empty. Frank noticed. In the kitchen, he watched Gerda stand motionless at the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, staring at nothing. He approached slowly, the way one might approach an injured animal. He said something in English. When she did not respond, he gently took her arm and guided her to a stool. Then he made hot chocolate, real chocolate mixed with milk and sugar, served in a mug he placed carefully in her hands. She drank it, slowly, and something in her face shifted. Not happiness, not relief, just the faintest recognition that the present moment, this moment, was separate from the destruction happening thousands of miles away. By June, the Texas heat had become absolute. The sun turned the camp into an oven. Metal surfaces became untouchable. The air shimmered in waves that made distant buildings look liquid. The women learned to move slowly, to seek shade, to drink water constantly from the canteens they carried. In the kitchen, conditions bordered on unbearable. The stoves radiated heat like blast furnaces. The ovens added layers of temperature that no amount of ventilation could dispel. Marguerite worked in a state of permanent sweat, her uniform soaked through before breakfast service ended. Frank installed additional fans. He allowed workers to take frequent breaks, rotating people through the walk-in freezer where they could stand among the hanging meat and feel their core temperature drop. The food changed with the season. Lighter meals, more salads, cold cuts instead of heavy roasts, iced tea by the gallon, sweet and dark, served in metal pitchers that sweated condensation. Ice cream appeared regularly, delivered in large tubs that workers scooped into bowls for dessert. The first time Marguerite tasted it, she understood why Americans treated it as something ordinary. In this heat, ice cream was not luxury. It was necessity. The garden struggled. Despite Ilse's attentions, despite daily watering, plants wilted under the brutal sun. The tomatoes cracked, the lettuce bolted. Only the peppers thrived, growing prolifically as if the heat fed them. Ilse adapted, planting varieties better suited to the climate, learning from local gardeners who understood this land's particular demands. One afternoon, a package arrived from a church group in Bastrop. Inside, more seeds. Also, inexplicably, 24 jars of peach preserves. Homemade, judging by the handwritten labels. The accompanying note, translated by the camp chaplain, explained that the church ladies had heard about the German women and wanted to help, to show Christian charity, to remind them that not all Americans were enemies. The women gathered in the barracks, staring at the jars. Peaches preserved in sugar syrup, golden and perfect, representing hours of labor from people who had no connection to them beyond shared humanity. Annalise opened one jar carefully, as if it might break. She spread a spoonful on bread from the mess hall and ate it with her eyes closed. "It tastes like someone's grandmother made it," she said quietly. Something was changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in small accumulated moments that built like water filling a basin. The women were gaining weight, sleeping better. Their skin, which had been gray with exhaustion and malnutrition, began to look healthy again. They laughed sometimes, told jokes, sang songs in the evenings, careful to choose ones that had no political content. Marguerite noticed changes in herself. She could climb stairs without losing her breath. Her hands had stopped trembling. The persistent headache that had plagued her for months had vanished. She looked in the small mirror above the barracks sink and saw someone who looked less like a ghost. But the transformation went deeper than physical health. It was psychological. A slow dismantling of assumptions that had been built so carefully by propaganda. They had been told Americans were brutal. They found them bureaucratic but fair. They had been told America was weak, decadent, on the verge of collapse. They found a country so productive that feeding prisoners well was simpler than feeding them poorly. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, crumbled when confronted with reality. Some women resisted this. They clung to old certainties, explaining away American kindness as manipulation or psychological warfare. Others accepted the new information with relief bordering on gratitude. They had been lied to. That lie was over. What came next was unclear, but at least it was real. Hild spoke about this one evening, sitting outside the barracks as the sun set and the heat finally began to break. "I do not know who I am anymore," she said quietly. "Everything I believed was wrong. So what am I?" Marguerite had no answer. She was asking herself the same question. In September, word came that Germany had been defeated months ago. The war in Europe was over. The information filtered through slowly, officially, translated, and posted on camp bulletin boards. The women gathered to read the announcements, their faces showing shock, grief, relief, confusion, all mixed together until individual emotions became impossible to separate. For Marguerite, the news brought numbness. She had known, intellectually, that defeat was coming. Everyone had known. But having it confirmed felt different, final. The world she had left was gone. What existed now was unknown. The camp administrators treated the announcement as significant but not transformative. The women were still prisoners, still under military authority. Their status had not changed. What had changed was the war's end. The purpose of their imprisonment had shifted from military necessity to administrative processing. But the food remained the same. Frank still cooked 3 meals daily with the same competence. Breakfast still arrived with eggs and coffee and fresh bread. The abundance continued, unchanged by the war's end or by anything happening thousands of miles away. Marguerite found this oddly comforting. In a world where everything had transformed beyond recognition, where certainty had become impossible, meals remained constant. Food arrived. Work continued. The garden still needed tending. Ilse harvested the last of the summer tomatoes, carefully saving seeds for next year, though none of them knew if there would be a next year for them in this place. She dried the seeds on newspaper, labeled them with careful handwriting, and stored them in envelopes. A gesture of faith or habit, or simply something to do with her hands. In November, Frank announced a special meal. Thanksgiving, an American tradition, he explained through gestures and broken translations. A day of gratitude, of feast, of abundance celebrated deliberately. The women watched preparations with growing confusion. Turkeys, massive birds that required hours of roasting. Stuffing made with bread and herbs and sausage. Mashed potatoes in quantities that seemed obscene. Gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pies cooling on racks. The kitchen smelled like someone's grandmother's house, rich and warm and impossibly domestic. On the day itself, the mess hall was decorated. Someone had found autumn leaves. Paper turkeys cut from construction paper hung from the ceiling fans. It looked absurd, like a child's school project expanded to institutional scale. But Frank seemed pleased, moving through the preparations with unusual energy. The meal was served at midday. The women filed in to find tables set with more food than they had seen even here, where abundance was normal. Frank had cooked as if feeding family rather than prisoners, as if this day mattered beyond utility or regulation. Marguerite sat with her plate piled high and felt tears sting her eyes. This was ridiculous, stupid. They were prisoners being fed by captors, and it meant nothing except that Americans had strange traditions. But the food was good. the turkey moist and flavorful, the stuffing rich with herbs. And around her, women were eating and talking and almost looking happy. Frank moved through the room, checking on things, and when he passed Marguerite's table, he paused. He looked at her directly. Then he nodded, just once. A gesture that meant something she could not quite name. Later, helping clean the kitchen, Marguerite found herself working beside Frank in comfortable silence. He handed her dishes to dry. She stacked them carefully. At some point, without planning it, she said in broken English, "Thank you." Frank looked at her. His weathered face showed no particular emotion. "You're welcome," he said. It was such a simple exchange. Meaningless, really. But Marguerite carried it with her through the rest of the day, through the weeks that followed, like proof of something she could not yet articulate. As the year turned toward its end, letters from home became more frequent. The mail system, disrupted by war's end, was reorganizing. Information flowed more freely now, though still filtered through censorship. Marguerite's mother wrote about Reconstruction, about hunger that was real now, not hidden, about American soldiers in the streets, neither cruel nor kind, just present. The Americans give children chocolate, her mother wrote. They sit in jeeps and toss candy to crowds. The children fight over it. It is humiliating and necessary. Marguerite thought about this while serving breakfast, while scooping eggs onto plates, while watching women eat as much as they wanted without thought of rationing. The same country that gave chocolate to German children in occupied cities fed German prisoners eggs and bacon and fresh bread. The same abundance, applied everywhere without apparent thought. It defied the logic she had learned. Enemies were supposed to be cruel. Victors were supposed to take revenge. Instead, Americans seemed to operate on some other principle entirely, one she was only beginning to understand. Other women received different news. Gerda learned her mother had survived, found living in a refugee camp in Bavaria. Anneliese discovered her fiancé was alive, a prisoner himself somewhere in England. Hild got word that her family's farm had been destroyed, but her father was rebuilding, slowly, with American aid and supervision. The war's aftermath was unfolding in ways none of them had predicted. Not apocalypse, not vengeance, just the massive bureaucratic machinery of occupation and reconstruction grinding forward, with the same impersonal efficiency that characterized everything Americans seemed to do. In January 1946, officials announced that repatriation would begin soon. The women would be processed, documented, and shipped home. Not immediately. The logistics were complex. But within months, probably by spring, they would return to Germany. The news brought relief and terror in equal measure. Relief because imprisonment, however benign, was still imprisonment. Terror because Germany was destroyed and unknown and home only in geography, not in any meaningful sense. Marguerite walked through the camp at dusk, watching shadows lengthen across the barracks, the mess hall, the garden where spring plantings were just beginning to emerge. She had lived here for almost a year. It had become familiar, safe. She knew the rhythms, understood the rules. She could walk from her bunk to the kitchen with her eyes closed. Germany was rubble and hunger and occupation. Going home and starting over in a place that no longer existed except as ruins. Frank noticed her distraction in the kitchen. One morning, during a break, he gestured her outside. They stood in the cool air, watching the sun rise across the flat Texas landscape. He did not speak, neither did she, but his presence was oddly comforting. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A recipe, she realized when he handed it to her, for biscuits, written in his messy handwriting with measurements and instructions, and a note at the bottom that read, "For when you're home." Marguerite took it carefully. Her throat felt tight. "Thank you," she managed in English. Frank nodded. Then he headed back inside, leaving her standing in the morning light with a piece of paper that represented more kindness than she knew how to process. The last breakfast came in March. The women had been processed, documented, vaccinated, prepared for transport. They would leave that afternoon, first by bus to Houston, then by ship to Bremerhaven. From there, dispersal to wherever home now meant. Frank made a special meal. Not as elaborate as Thanksgiving, but better than standard breakfast. Fresh fruit, extra bacon. Biscuits made from the recipe he had given Marguerite, which she would carry in her pocket across the ocean and into whatever came next. The women ate quietly, aware this was ending. The comfort, the abundance. The strange sanctuary they had found in imprisonment. They would miss it. That was shameful, but true. They would miss eating until full. Miss sleeping without fear. Miss the simple predictability of camp life. Marguerite helped clean the kitchen one final time. She washed dishes, dried them, put them away in their designated places. Frank worked beside her, silent as always, his presence steady and uncomplicated. When they finished, he walked her to the door. Then he extended his hand. She shook it, feeling the calluses, the strength that came from years of practical work. "Good luck," he said. She nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her chest. Outside, the other women were gathering, forming lines for processing. Marguerite joined them, carrying a small bag with her possessions, letters from home, the recipe, a jar of peach preserves she had saved. Not much, but more than she had arrived with. The bus was already waiting. Years later, Marguerite would tell her children about the camp. Not about the capture or the fear, but about the food. The abundance. The way Frank had fed them not as prisoners, but as people who deserved to eat well. She would describe breakfast eggs and bacon and fresh bread, and watch her children's faces show confusion. Why would an enemy do that? She had spent years trying to answer that question, not fully succeeding, but understanding more than she had at 19. Understanding that Americans had not been kind to be manipulative. They had been kind because abundance made kindness simple, because feeding people well was easier than feeding them poorly when resources were unlimited, because in a country that large, that productive, generosity cost less than cruelty. But Frank had made it personal. That was the difference. He had cooked as if it mattered, as if the women eating his food were not statistics, or prisoners, or enemies, but people. Hungry people. Lost people. People far from home. That had defeated the propaganda more effectively than any argument could have. Not because Americans were morally superior, but because one man in a Texas camp kitchen had simply done his job well, and in doing so, had shown Marguerite that the world was larger and stranger, and more generous than she had been told. She kept the recipe her whole life, used it dozens of times. The biscuits never came out quite right, different ovens, different climates, different flour, but she made them anyway. For her children, her grandchildren, each batch a small act of remembrance for a kindness she had not deserved but had received anyway. In a time when the world was breaking and one man made breakfast as if it mattered. The war ended, the camps closed. The women went home to rubble and reconstruction and lives that bore no resemblance to what they had left. But they carried something with them that propaganda could never touch again. The memory of abundance. The taste of eggs and bacon and fresh bread. Proof that everything they had been told was a lie. And in kitchens across Germany, in the years that followed, when bread was baked and simple meals prepared, some women remembered Texas, remembered heat and dust, and a gruff American cook who fed them better than they had any right to expect. It was not forgiveness, not friendship exactly, just the slow erosion of certainty, replaced by something more complicated and more honest. The recognition that even in war, even among enemies, some people simply chose to be decent, and that decency, more than any weapon, could transform hearts that propaganda had tried so hard to harden. Texas, 1945. The sun blazing, the tables laden, the impossible abundance, and 23 women learning, one meal at a time, that the world was different than they had been taught.